It's the state auditor of the great state of Mississippi, Shad White. Auditor, good to see you, sir. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you for having me, brother. I appreciate it.
Man. So you probably heard us out there in the green room. We've been discussing, certainly in the second half hour of our first hour of the broadcast, this crazy spending that occurs at the federal level. The one that got my attention in particular was $500 billion now, the CBO tells us, on expired programs. I don't even see how that happens.
Yeah. Well, frankly, I was more terrified of running into one of these meth monkeys at Ole Miss the next time I go.
How in the world? I mean, I'm embarrassed, honestly.
On campus, where do I find them? How do I avoid them? These are real questions. It's nuts reading about this stuff. And you know, I hate to say it, but as crazy as we think it is coming from the federal government, we see similar things happen in Mississippi with our taxpayer money. And that's the kind of stuff I've been pointing out for the last 2 years. Give you two examples from our alma mater, Ole Miss. We looked and dug into their DEI spending. Of course, they had over 20 DEI staffers. The top staffer was being paid more than the governor and lieutenant governor combined. And their biggest achievement, one of their biggest achievements last year, was handing out a grant for preschool social justice yoga. To study preschool social justice yoga. I have no idea what that is. That's not a far cry from the meth monkey scenario, you know. And so we see that, and we see our state taxpayer dollars going to pay for salaries for people that are doing this kind of stuff, and it's happening here in Mississippi. And as auditor, I know I can't change it. I can't go in and tell them, hey, you got to stop doing that, but I can shine a light on it. And that, to me, is what DOJ is going to do. Even if DOJ can't shut everything down, DOJ is going to go in, I hope, and identify all of this kind of waste. And that way, then we can start the big fight, the big legal battle to get a handle on all this stuff.
Well, speaking of the DEI stuff, I mean, it's something that, when I started doing the show back in 2020, all of this really got intensified and escalated throughout the public and private sector after the George Floyd incident. That's what really set it on the path that it's on today. But it's one thing to ensure that you're not discriminating. It's another when you're forcing it. And what these DEI groups do is they force diversity and equity and inclusion, which achieves nothing. Forced diversity, forced inclusion is not anything. When it happens organically and naturally, good, great. Yep. That's the way it should work. But spending money to force it, which is what I feel like happened, can't we just do what has happened in Florida, I believe, and in Texas as an example, where they passed legislation that says we're not giving you any more money for this in higher ed, right?
That's right. North Carolina, Alabama, Idaho, Utah, Wyoming, Oklahoma.
Well, Florida and Texas, I think, sort of got it started.
That's right. Yeah. And I'll give you an example from North Carolina. What they did specifically, they shut down spending on DEI, which is great, and then they took every penny that they were spending on DEI and decided to spend it on campus police to make their campuses safer. That's just common sense stuff. And unfortunately, what we did in Mississippi is after I started highlighting some of the DEI spending, and you and I talked about it and how wasteful and frankly how dangerous it was to be putting on these ridiculous kinds of seminars that were trying to brainwash students, the legislature didn't do anything, didn't cut the funding like some of our other states around us did. So these programs at our universities decided to change their names. So instead of calling themselves DEI, they now call themselves, Opportunity and, Pink Rainbows or whatever. They changed the words. They changed the words. And now some of them have even said, well, we're not really changing what we did. We just changed the label. A staffer at the University of Southern Mississippi came out and said that to the press. We're not changing what we were doing. We're just changing the label on the door. So we still have this problem in Mississippi. We still need the legislature to pass a bill that says no more spending money on this kind of stuff. And instead, let's get the money going to something that actually benefits students. If you want to help poor students get access to college, how about scholarships for poor students to get access to college? If you want to keep students safer on campus and let them feel more included in campus life, well, how about we put the money into campus police so students don't have to run around campus and fear if they're going to the next event on campus? Yeah. These are the kinds of common sense things we need to be doing, but unfortunately common sense doesn't always win out, even in a state like Mississippi.
It's possible, Auditor, to draft legislation that would prevent this subversion that we're seeing now. I mean,
that's right.
It could be done, and we could root it out and expose it, say, no, that violates the specifics of the law, and you can't do that.
Yep, that's right. And that legislation exists. There was one bill that was pretty good that was filed by Senator Angela Hill in the state Senate last year. It died, unfortunately. But I looked at that bill a couple of days ago, and I saw, that's the kind of thing that we need to be doing.
Very straightforward. I remember it.
Very straight. Exactly right. Very straightforward. And if nothing else, that puts these universities on notice. Hey, there is legislation that has been passed into law that restricts your ability to spend money on this nonsense. And you can fight us on this, and you can quibble with the language in the law. But if we could get something like that into law, it forces them to think twice before they start shelling out our money into this stuff. That's been the focus of mine for the last couple of years, and that led, of course, into the big waste cutting project that we did called Project Momentum, which came out last month. And that's what we need at the federal level too. That's what DOJ is going to become at the federal level, I think.
So the Project Momentum, is this something, Auditor, that you discussed with the legislature before you commissioned it, or you just did it on your own accord from your budget? Tell us about that.
Yep, that's right. So the state auditor, under the statute that governs my office, gives us broad authority to not only do audits, but also do pre-audits of financial activities, post-audits of financial activities, investigate the financial affairs. This is the kind of broad language that the auditor's statute says. And so what we did is I discussed this actually with the governor and started talking to him and said, what we're thinking about doing is kind of what the state auditor's office did back in the 1990s, which is do a big study for waste in state government. And because it's been too long since we've done an audit focused specifically on waste, not necessarily on fraud or theft or misspending, like spending outside of the bounds of the law, but just waste, just fat. So had that conversation with him. He was excited about it because we're both fiscal conservatives, and it seemed like the natural next step to try to make government leaner and smarter. The reason I wanted to talk to him about it is that we ended up looking at a lot of the agencies that answer to the governor's office, because those are big agencies like Medicaid.
Yep.
So then we commissioned the report, used the budget from the auditor's office. We had been frugal with our money from the legislature for the past few years, and so we had that money sitting in our budget, and then deployed that against this project, pulled in some national experts, a lot like the company that you used to work for, consulting company. And once we started doing that, we were able to not only get data about the waste that's happening in Mississippi, not only uncover some problems that had not been widely talked about, like the amount of insurance that we pay on state office buildings, which is insanely high, but also compare that to other states around the country. So this team that we pulled in had helped Texas, had helped North Carolina, had helped other states right-size their state agencies, and we could then point to real data that said, yeah, everybody always complains about how many cars we have in state government, but how do we compare to states like Louisiana or Arkansas or Iowa? Are we doing better than them? Maybe we have a bunch of cars, but we're doing better than all the other states, and maybe that's a good thing. As it turns out, we're not doing better than other states. We're doing worse than those other three states that are very similar to us. So that was kind of the basis for the whole project.
Gotcha. So based on the findings, Auditor, are there some specific requests that you have made or intend to make of the legislature to start codifying in statute some changes here to address these issues? Absolutely.
So what I would say is when we finish the report, some of the recommendations are things that a state agency head could do on their own. So, for example, for one agency, we said, you got 3 contracts doing the same thing, and one of those vendors is the cheapest. Get rid of 2 of them. And the agency head could do that on their own. So we had a ton of recommendations like that. But then separately, we had a ton of recommendations that would require some kind of legislative change. So I'll give you an example of the biggest one probably. The biggest one that we found was in education. Mississippi spends a higher percentage of our education K-12 dollars on administration than every other state in the South. That is simply unacceptable. I mean, we have the highest paid state superintendent of education, but the lowest paid teachers. We have local superintendents who are making more money than the governor, and teachers in those school districts still going out of pocket to pay for their own classroom supplies. This makes no sense at all. So we'll have a couple of legislative options this year to throw at the legislature and say, hey, look, if you want to get a real handle on this, what you could do is something similar to what Texas does, which is to say for school districts that are losing students, you're capped on the amount of money you can spend on admin costs at the dollar amount that you're spending this year. So your overhead can't go up. Or you could say 50% of every dollar that you spend has to go to teacher salaries. That would boost the amount of money going into the classroom, cut the amount of money going into administration. Those are the kinds of ideas that we'll end up throwing at them.
Well, that's something that could be enacted into law.
Absolutely.
Right? Yeah.
Would have to be enacted into law to push those school districts.
Okay. Otherwise, they are kind of autonomous on that sort of stuff.
That's exactly right.
All right. We got Auditor of Mississippi Shad White as our guest. So you hear folks, and I got one on the C Spire tax line, a message here, Auditor, the zero-based budgeting, for example, is something. Should we adopt that in the state of Mississippi?
I think all of those kinds of ideas are great. Zero-based budgeting, forcing more employees to justify their employment, cutting agencies that way. Those are all great ideas. The challenge that I have noticed is that even in states where you see budgets that sunset and the agencies have to go and they have to, re-justify what they've been spending money on, it's easy for legislators to just say, yep, sounds good, rubber stamp, you re-justified everything, same amount of money as last year or more, unless you give them specific examples of waste happening inside those agencies.
Yeah.
And so what we wanted to do with Project Momentum is to give some specific examples of ways we could save money. And it's not to say that these agencies are all functioning poorly. It's just to say, here are the examples of things that we could be doing better. TV screens that are being purchased for $5,800 a pop, which is a real thing in the state of Mississippi, unfortunately. And those same TV screens are being purchased by the federal government for about a couple $1,000s, even as wasteful as the federal government is. We wanted to give details like that about that IT contract to be able to say, all right, here's where you should be asking your questions when you get those agencies in their appropriations hearing, and this gives you a reason to dig in and to force them to get tighter in their budget and to be more efficient.
So just explain to the audience, it just means you start over every year. You don't start with last year's budget.
That's right.
And then adjust from that, assuming that you need it every time you got last year and all the previous years. No, you start with, you got nothing. We need you to justify what you need, and then we essentially authorize that.
That's exactly right. That's right. And that just has to be, as much as it is a legal change, that also has to be an attitude change for the appropriators. They have to walk into the appropriations hearing saying, we're going to pretend like we gave you $0 last year. Now go. Now tell me why you need the money that you're asking for.
More effort and brain power involved in that process. Yeah. But it's, I think, would be a worthy exercise. The governor, I'm sure you've seen his budget recommendation, which came out, I think, Friday, if I'm not mistaken. Yep. And it's slightly down from the prior year. You know, the governor wants to eliminate the income tax. The lieutenant governor seems to be more focused on the sales tax on groceries. I think the Speaker of the House is kind of, how about a hybrid sort of deal?
Yeah.
But and we're still generating handsome, tidy revenues. We could afford some cutting for sure, but
that's exactly right.
We need to get more money back in the pockets of the people. But we could take even further steps, I believe, to your report. That's what you're pointing out.
That's exactly right.
To give us that spending model that we need that would allow us to cut taxes.
Yep, that's exactly right. So if you look, great point about the governor's budget. I forget what his number was, but he had specifically cited some number of hundreds of millions of dollars that could be redeployed against a tax cut because our revenues have been up.
Yep.
So then let's say you coupled that with all the savings that we found in Project Momentum, which was about $335 million worth of recurring waste every single year. If you did that, you're talking about getting to exactly what some of these guys are discussing, which is eliminating the grocery tax and cutting income tax at the same time. So there's a road forward here, but we have to be smarter about how we spend money. We have to be more frugal. We have to figure out ways to get those cuts done. And then we have to make the smart decision about deploying those dollars against things that actually matter to real people. Tax cuts, roads and bridges, cops on the street, teacher salaries, those things that make a difference in real people's lives.
Half or slightly more than half of our general fund budget goes to education.
Yep.
A lot of that, of course, the lion's share of that's K through 12.
Yep.
Always been a lot of discussion, as you know, about pursuing some school district consolidation. We've got considerably more districts than we have even counties. Now,
that's right.
Sometimes that's understandable just because of the population and the student population served. It just makes for a better model. We've got some opportunity here, though, do we not, to consolidate?
I agree, but I would say this, too. Consolidation on its own does not achieve the savings that you want.
I've said that here on this show many times.
It's very important to realize that this waste is really sticky. It's hard to get rid of.
Yes.
So we see situations in Mississippi where two school districts, a municipal one and a county one, have consolidated. And if at the end of the consolidation all you have done is change the labels on the buildings, you have not achieved savings. If you don't fire anybody or let people retire and not refill their positions, you have achieved no savings. Instead of taking two purchasing clerks and turning them into one, you still have two purchasing clerks. You haven't saved any money. So, yeah, you can consolidate and save money, but it takes another step. You have to have good local superintendents who are willing to say, nope, you know what? We're going to use this opportunity to get leaner and more efficient and dump those dollars into the classroom. That's hard.
And then
you've got, really
as you know, you've got school district boards as well that want to stay in power. And so you talk about consolidating districts. What does that look like, when you start consolidating those boards? Now, that's not so much an expense perspective as it is the governance of the districts.
It's a political problem, right?
It's a big-time
local political problem.
Yeah.
There are ways to get at this, though, and it goes. One of the ideas, again, goes back to the idea of requiring 50% of every dollar to go toward teacher salaries. That would be a boost of tens of millions of dollars immediately, and then you would put a roadmap forward for these school districts, and you would say, all right, this is where you got to get, and we're going to put some buffers on either side of the road so you can't go outside that. We're going to have to get serious about this, or we're going to continue spending money in a way that is inefficient. And I've said this over and over again, if we want better results in Mississippi, if we want to do justice for our children who are in our public schools and spend money on them wisely, we're going to have to change a few things.
Yeah.
What's the definition of insanity according to Einstein? It's doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. We're going to have to change a few things. But if we do that, we can, I think, achieve some really amazing results. And you're seeing it. You saw it in 2013 with a few policy changes in the third grade reading gate. Our reading scores started to tick up a whole lot. We need to keep making those kinds of changes, pushing money into the classroom and outside of the programs that just benefit, adults and adult employees of the school districts, and that's how we get there. The
way to achieve, I believe, the governor's goal, and in his most recent budget, literally, folks, this was just published late Friday. We got the income tax being phased down through the end of 26 to 4%, one flat bracket. 4%, all taxable income above $10,000. He's calling for that to be reduced to 3% for fiscal year 26. And then he wants to phase out the 3% in increments of 2% and 1% through 27 and 28. He says we can get to zero by 29, but I think the path to getting there is to take some of these spending cut actions.
That's right. That's exactly right. And I think what he's setting out is reasonable if you do the spending cuts. You could also think about it this way. If you eliminated the state income tax, the last time I looked at the numbers, it would take us kind of back to the budget that we were in FY14 or so about 10 years ago. That's not adjusted for inflation, but that shows you that not that long ago we were kind of spending about that much money. And depending on which census numbers you believe, we may have had more people in Mississippi back then than we do now. So government services serving an equal or smaller number of people, but expense going up every year. That's the kind of thing that he's talking about in that budget. If our population is relatively stable, our revenues keep going up every year, we got to use that money in a way that benefits people, that benefits the folks who are working, paying their taxes, going to Walmart, shopping, going to church, following the rules, doing the right thing every day. Those are the people that keep Mississippi going. That's what we've got to start thinking about.
Anything for us before we complete our talk that's going on at the state auditor's office? Any updates there?
I just got an investigations update this morning, so a lot of arrests. Unfortunately, you hate to see it, but a lot of arrests coming up here in the next little while, and I'm going to continue talking about this Mississippi's Doge, basically the project that we just finished. as we lead up to the legislative session, because my hope is that legislators will look at it and they'll take it seriously, that we'll finally cut funding for these DEI programs, that we'll finally get money going to where it can make the most difference for Mississippians.
Well, just kind of thinking how the dots are connected before we go here, I'm thinking if we can eliminate some of the crazy, frivolous, wasteful, unnecessary spending, eliminate the income tax, draw more investment into the state by businesses, we can start keeping some of the graduates who we're paying to go to educate.
100%.
And we're subsidizing the other states with that money.
Atlanta should send us a thank you note every year for all the graduates we send there. Hey, man, this has been fun.
Appreciate it.
Avoid that meth monkey. Stay away from it.
Auditor Shad White has been our guest in the Element Wealth studio. We're coming right back.